This online lecture covers the art of prehistory. More specifically, it covers the Paleolithic period. Now, in terms of prehistory, we divide it up into three distinct periods, which you can see here on the screen: the Paleolithic, Mesolithic, and Neolithic periods. And for this lecture, we are only going to be talking about the Paleolithic period. The Neolithic period will be different lectures. I'm actually going to skip the Mesolithic period in this class. We're not going to talk about it. I skip the Mesolithic period because I see it as kind of a transitional period where there's a lot of changes that are happening between the Paleolithic and Neolithic period, and we're not seeing anything really significant or very clear in terms of artistic production that we can assign to one period or the other. So it can be kind of complicated to study transitional periods, and that's why I think we'll just go ahead and skip it. So we are going to be looking at the Paleolithic period. Now, I posed some questions here on the screen to kind of set up the context for what we're going to be looking at. What are the circumstances that are surrounding the production of the artworks that we're going to be looking at in this lecture? Now, first, let's talk about the Stone Age. Why are these periods called the Stone Age? Now, you may have learned about this in a previous class. We refer to these periods as the Stone Age because they used stone tools. So Paleolithic means Old Stone Age, Neolithic, New Stone Age. Now the next question is, how is each period differentiated? Why do we divide these up? Why can't we just refer to this as just the Stone Age? Now we do divide it up because we have very different living conditions for humans in the two different periods, Paleolithic and Neolithic period. In the Paleolithic period, man was primarily nomadic. So people moved around to follow the food source. In the Neolithic period, and this is something I will address more at length in the Neolithic lecture, we do see that man begins to stay in one place for longer periods of time. And that does impact art very much. It does revolutionize what the early humans were creating. Now think about this. Okay, what does any of this have to do with art? If you were somebody that's living in the Paleolithic period and you're having to move around to follow your food source, think about what kind of art you would make. You want to make something that's going to complement your nomadic lifestyle. So you would probably want to make things that are small, that are lightweight, that are easy to transport. Back in the Paleolithic period, life was pretty hard, and pretty much all of existence is completely focused on survival. So you're not going to waste your time or energy or resources on things that aren't necessarily going to help with survival. So when it makes sense to create really large, heavy sculptures that you have to leave behind, or works of architecture. Now, because of this, we're not going to be looking at examples of architecture in the Paleolithic period. This is not to say that people didn't make any sort of architecture. We do see examples of early humans creating huts out of mammoth bones, but we're not going to look at those in lecture. So everything is portable. There is one exception, and that is cave paintings, which we will be looking at the end of this lecture. Now there's one other thing to address really quick before we move on, and that is this difference between prehistoric and historic societies. Now, this is something else you may know from the previous class. What is it that we look at to determine if a society is prehistoric or historic? The answer to this question is a written word. If they have the written word, then they're considered historic because we can get information from their text. Prehistoric, no written word. So with the Paleolithic and Neolithic periods, we're going to be looking at art that was produced in a time when there is not written language. We use written language quite a bit to help formulate our interpretations of art. So what you're going to hear a lot of in this lecture and the Neolithic lecture is a lot of I don't knows, or a lot of different interpretations that people have. You can have a lot of ideas when you don't have text to necessarily substantiate what you're thinking the artwork is going to be about. Now, this distinction between prehistoric and historic, this binary, is not as neat and tidy as we would hope. You will be seeing in this class some cultures that occupy this weird intermediate area where the culture has written language, but it hasn't yet been translated. So technically it's historic, they have the written word, but we can't glean information from it, so it kind of makes it prehistoric. Okay, let's look at art. So we're going to start out by looking at one of the more famous sculptures that has been discovered from the Paleolithic period, and this is the woman from Willendorf. And it's called Willendorf because it's named after the city in Austria that this sculpture was discovered. Now, if you look at this sculpture, okay, a couple things to notice. Okay, first of all, what we're looking at is we're looking at sculpture in the round. So what this means, sculpture in the round, is that the sculpture actually has been sculpted on all sides. If you took this sculpture and you turned it around, you would see that the woven pattern up here extends all the way around the back of the head, and then you have her backside carved and all of that. So it's a fully rounded figure. When you look at sculpture in the round, ideally you want to look at all sides. There's this idea that you don't really actually get the full idea of the artwork until you can see it from all sides. So this is sculpture in the round. Now there's a couple other terms here that we might as well note at this time, and these terms are mobiliary and parietal. Now mobiliary, what this means is it means that the artwork is mobile, that it can move around, where parietal will be artworks that are staying in one place. Things like architecture, large-scale sculpture, which we are not going to see in this lecture, and then finally cave paintings. Those are examples of parietal work because they don't move around, they stay in the cave. Now the other thing I want to point out is the size, approximately 5 inches. That's pretty mini, it's not that large in size. This tiny size is going to complement the lifestyle of the nomadic people, that this is something that can be held in the hand, easily moved around, light. Now the disproportionately small feet that we see at the bottom of the sculpture supports this. These feet would not hold up the weight of this sculpture, which indicates that it was not meant to be displayed, that it was meant to be handheld. All right, now let's talk about some other features of this work. Okay, so here we have the navel, right? We've got a nude female form, and at the center point of the design of the sculpture, the center point of the body, is the navel. This navel actually is a natural cavity in the stone. This is not a hole that the artist made. The artist found this piece of rock, and the hole was already there, and they designed this sculpture around this hole. Now I want to point this out because it evidences a unique technique for creating art that really is unique to the Paleolithic period. And what this is this, that the artist is conforming the design to the material. Conforming the design to the material, okay? Now what that means, and it's kind of like opposite of the way that artists normally work, what this means is that instead of coming up with an idea in their mind and then forcing the material to conform to that idea, the artist finds the material, and from the natural contours of the material will then create the work of art. This is unique to the Paleolithic period. We don't see this technique really being used in subsequent periods. And the reason why I'm pointing this out is because for your midterm exam, you're definitely going to have to know differences between Paleolithic and Neolithic art. And this is one of these examples, this difference in technique. Now the other thing I want to point out is I want to point out some of the iconography, some of the symbolism, right? And we do consider the nudity to be iconography. We see that there's very particular parts of this figure that has been emphasized: the breasts, the hips, the belly, and the genitalia. Now, what we're thinking is that this is going to be a reference to fertility, referring to the fertility of the figure. It's this idea that back in the Paleolithic period, people didn't have, their PPO health insurance plans where they go to Kaiser Permanente and get prenatal care. It's a little bit of a more rougher situation. People are kind of having trouble in terms of conceiving, carrying the child to term, successfully having the child, and raising the child past infancy. So what a lot of scholars believe is that this figure is kind of almost like a fertility amulet. This would be a possession of a woman, and it would help her to successfully reproduce children. Now, there's been another theory, and this is actually kind of a contentious theory. Here's some art history drama for you. Some people say that this could be an early image of a goddess, more particularly an erotic goddess. And a lot of people started to question this theory. Why do we always think that images of women are goddesses? I have to be honest with you. I don't hate this theory. I think we have to be careful. But I don't hate it, because we do see actually throughout the history of the ancient world this prototype of the erotic goddess. And one of the things that kind of links this erotic goddess across time and culture is nudity that is emphasized, particularly the breast and the genitalia. Oftentimes the nudity is emphasized by the way that the sculpture or the figure is positioned, with arms at the breasts or alongside the hips or directly framing the pubic area. And these little things right here, these are the arms. So it does kind of replicate this really common position that we see these erotic goddesses being depicted in. But again, this is something that's a little bit of a debate among art historians. Let's take a look at another example. This is the Woman of La Salle. Now, what you can see here is this is a different type of sculpture. This is called a relief sculpture. What this means is the sculpture is only meant to be seen from the front. If you turn the sculpture around, you would just see like the texture of rock. Nothing would be carved in as well, at all. And so what happens is you can see here that the image kind of like emerges from the front face of the rock. This type of sculpture is really common on flat surfaces, particularly walls. And so when we go along and we see the development of architecture in this class, you'll notice that many buildings will have relief sculpture as a form of adornment. And there's a couple different types of relief sculpture. You don't have to know this for your exam, but I am just going to mention it because why not? There's low or bas. It looks like basse, but it's French, which means we don't say the end of the word. Bas versus high. Bas is where it comes out just a little bit. High relief is where the image will extend out quite a bit. So this is relief sculpture, only seen from the front. Sculpture like the woman from Willendorf, that one can be seen from all sides. This is the Woman of La Salle. This is also referring to the city that this sculpture which was discovered in, which is France. Now you can see it's pretty similar to what we've got going on with the Woman of Willendorf. You've got the nudity, you've got the breasts and the hips and the genitalia. And I just want to point out, here's an arm that's kind of indicating, a little implied line towards the genitalia, that kind of erotic goddess sort of motif that we see here. Again, a possibility, again, debatable. The difference is, though, we have this figure holding something. And you know what that means? If you were thinking iconographical analysis, you'd be correct. We get to try to decipher what this is symbolizing. Now, scholars have offered a few ideas, okay? I will go in order from the idea I do not like at all to the idea that I like best. Now, the idea that I really don't like is a lot of scholars, or not a lot, but a number of scholars have suggested that this is a cornucopia. Cornucopia is that, for example, that basket at Thanksgiving, that's like a horn you put on your table, fruits and vegetables spill out of it. And so the reason why you would have a cornucopia is it would be like a representation of abundance, right? So because the female nudity could suggest this fertility reference, this idea of abundance, right? To have a lot of children, not 2.5 children, but as many children as women could have, because infant mortality rate, they were so high. And I was thinking about this. I'm like, oh, that's interesting that back in the Paleolithic period, they had the concept of the cornucopia. So you know what I did when things don't sit well with me? I did research. And what I found out was that this concept of the cornucopia, as it is linked to abundance, really doesn't become a thing until ancient Greece, which is like way later on than this image here. Also, they didn't have agriculture yet, so I don't really know what would be, spilling out of this horn. Maybe like nuts and fruits. Who knows? I don't really like this. It's making me uncomfortable, this idea of the cornucopia. Now, another interpretation is that this is a bison horn. And scholars say that the reason why this is a bison horn is because in the Paleolithic period, the bison horn was a symbol of a woman's uterus. Okay, I think that's fine. I'm going to not lose sleep over that one tonight. The third interpretation, though, is the one that I like the best. And what this interpretation says is that this horn is a crescent moon. And if you look close, you can see there's lines that are incised onto this horn. There's 13 of them. 13 lines corresponds with the 13 lunar months. Now what they say is that a woman's menstrual cycle is also 13 months. I don't know if you've ever heard when a woman's on her period, she'll say it's her moon time. And it's this idea that women's bodies are in sync, or they can be in sync with the phases of the moon. Now think about this in terms of the context of fertility. In order to get pregnant, you absolutely have to be menstruating. So this makes really nice sense conceptually. The other thing that I think is really compelling about this interpretation is that when this sculpture was originally discovered, it was discovered covered with a powdered pigment that was red. So scholars say this could be a symbol for blood. You could say it's the blood at childbirth, you could say it's menstrual blood. It doesn't matter, because either of those arguments would work within the context of this imagery. What I also think is interesting, not a coincidence, because there's no such thing as coincidences, that the Venus of Willendorf, which we looked at just a minute ago, this sculpture also was originally covered in a red ochre when it was discovered as well. Okay, let's look at another sculpture. Lion Human is what this is called. Descriptive title, a lion and a human. What this is it's a hybrid figure. It's a mixture of what we call zoomorphic, which you do not have to write that down, zoomorphic, which is animals, and anthropomorphic people, or zoomorphic, tomato, tomato. Anyhow, what we see here is a sculpture that is 12 inches. This actually would make this a very large sculpture for the period. This is one of the largest sculptures that has been discovered from this period. It's almost a foot tall. Now you can see that it's long and thin, okay, and it's very different stylistically from the Venus, or the woman from Willendorf, which is wide. Now this again has to do with the design conforming to the material. This originally was carved from the tusk of a mammoth, and tusks, as you know, are long and thin, which makes sense why this one would be compact, long, and thin. This stone has these contours, which better lends to this design here. Now, in terms of a hybrid figure, okay, what does this mean? We don't know. We don't know. There's a lot of possibilities what this could be. Some people argue that this is an indication of religious belief during this time. Now, we have to be really careful with this idea of religion, okay? We don't yet have in the Paleolithic period institutionalized religion. And what that means is it means they didn't have like temples or churches. They didn't have priests or like religious hierarchy really. They didn't have like a sort of like doctrine in terms of like what you had to do, how you had to practice the religion. Now, I do think though that they did probably have beliefs in I'm not going to say, well, maybe the gods, some sort of force that sort of mediates human life, something that kind of would be used in explanation for some of the mysteries of life. Now, if we want to make an argument that this is a god, okay, we can make the argument because, first of all, this is obviously a mythic figure. I don't think in the Paleolithic period there was such a thing as lion humans, okay? So obviously this isn't real. Now, when we are talking about religion, much of religion is predicated on myth, right? This idea of things that kind of defy reality, which is okay. It asks the worshiper to sort of practice faith and belief within these ideas. But because we don't have any sort of historical information, it makes this really hard. Now, one thing we can do, and you are allowed to do this, is you can kind of work backwards, as long as you're careful about this. What we could do is we could look at other historic societies, like, for example, Mesopotamia and Egypt. And those are historic societies. They do have written word. We absolutely know historical information about these cultures. In these cultures, as part of their religious beliefs, they had hybrid figures as deities. So you could kind of make that argument and justify it in that way, because the idea is, if you're going to make an interpretation, you need some sort of evidence to back it up. Bison with a turned head. This is a great little sculpture, 4 inches, so super mini, and we can see that it's small scale, so that the person who possessed this sculpture could take it with. Now, this sculpture is from a reindeer horn, which is explaining why it's so tiny as well, because obviously horns don't yield like a ton of material. Now we're seeing an animal, which is a very common subject matter in Paleolithic sculpture. And what's unique about this sculpture is the artist's decision to have the head turned inward. So we're looking at a profile image where you're looking at it from the side, but instead of looking at it with the head sort of coming out this way, it turns inward. And scholars have asked why. That's really unique. Like, we don't really see images really doing this. Now we can say a couple things. One, we could say that it's a space-saving device. Artist comes across this nice little 4-inch piece of reindeer horn, totally want to use it for a sculpture, but because there's not enough room, the head is turned inward. That is a possibility. Now another possibility, and I quite like this one, is that the artist was trying to give a sense of the essence of the bison, the bisonness of the bison, right? This idea of this animal moving, like, look at the diagonal positioning of the legs. Maybe it's running, maybe it's jumping. It's like turning its head back to look as it propels itself through space. This idea that we get the sense that it's alive, that it has a sense of energy. This is one of the things that I really like about Paleolithic period art. We see this with the sculpture, we definitely see it with the cave painting, is they really do look at the essence of the animal, its spirit. That's really, really sophisticated for circa 11,000 BCE. This idea of how do I capture this sort of inanimate idea of a soul, of a being, of an energy within an animal. To me, it conveys a respect of the animal, an interest on the part of the artist to create a very realistic artwork by capturing not only the physical features of the animal, but some of its psychology as well. This is the other thing I will say about the Paleolithic period, that these are very, very sophisticated works of art. And they're so old. What I say is it really is indicating that art and the expression of ideas through art is something that is specific to man. This is something that's in our DNA, something that emerges pretty much when human beings come onto the scene. What's the first thing we do? We start making art. And it's not like, stick figures, but it's actually really good, really legit, really sophisticated art. Art like bison with a turned head. Here's some more bison. And I'm showing you these because these are the largest sculptures known to have been made in the Paleolithic period. They're about half-life size, which is about 2 feet. So that's something that's really rare. And the other thing that's rare, obviously because of the size, is they are parietal. What does parietal mean? Staying in one place. So they're not meant to be moved around. Now these are made out of clay, unlike the other works that we've been looking at that have been made out of horns or teeth or stone, clay. And it's made out of the immediate local material. So what the artist did is gathered up the clay, the dirt from in the cave, and they molded these figures. Now these figures are against a rock, and the question is why? One of the ideas is that perhaps these are leaning against the rock because they actually needed the rock to hold up the sculptures. So what happened was, because these are made out of clay, in the Paleolithic period, they did not yet have firing techniques for their ceramics. So what happens is, if you work with ceramics, if you're working with clay, you have to fire it. And what that means is you have to heat it. You heat it at a really high temperature. And what happens is it causes the clay particles to melt, and then they fuse together. And that's what makes the ceramics strong and able to hold themselves upright. Because these aren't fired, they're weak. And so to keep them upright, they're buttressed up against the stone. Now, the other thing, though, we know is that these artists are trying to convey these animals as realistically as possible, coming in, sort of incising these lines for the mane or the beard hair or whatever this is called here. Little details like this tail sort of coming out like this, even just kind of the shape of the body, this nice little hump. Great sculptures. And with this realism, they're trying to convey maybe like the natural landscape. Bison hang out around rocks, and they show that by placing them in this way. All right, we're moving on to sculpture. Now, for your exam, you don't have to know any of the cave names. You don't have to know where they are. I just have them here for your information. So what we're looking at is we're looking at a detail of the Chauvet Cave, which is located in France. The best examples of cave painting from the Paleolithic period have been found in France and in Spain, particularly France, though. So what we're looking at is we're looking at these animals, and we're looking into detail. I love these horses. This is such a fabulous painting because what it conveys is it conveys this sense of sophistication, which we've already been talking about, and accuracy. This really delicate gradation of shading here to suggest that these are fully rounded three-dimensional forms. This artist clearly, through the use of both vertical placement and overlap, is suggesting 4 receding planes of space. I think that is amazing. Really, really sophisticated. I love these animals here fighting, this kind of quick sort of line drawing, but yet there is this sense of realism and implied weight and bulk, strength and a power to these animals. So, so good. Now, one of the things about this is that the way they painted them indicated that these were pre-planned, that they just didn't like cruise into a cave and just like paint something randomly. Now, it indicates that they're pre-planned is that they conform to the contours of the cave, which this shouldn't be too shocking to us because we know that this is a common technique of art making in the Paleolithic period, is to conform the design to the material. So they came in, they saw a contour, and then they put the work in accordingly, that it's planned and it's strategic. Now, if this sounds abstract to you, kind of not really seeing how this would work, take a look at this one. In this sculpture, this is a great example of being strategic. We have these horses, right? These horses are placed just so that the bellies of the horse, which if you think about these horses in their belly, they kind of like they come out. The bellies are put right over a place in the stone where it's extending out into space. So it looks like the horse's belly actually is extending out into space as well. Implies three-dimensionality. I love that. Now this is an interesting painting because we have these handprints. Now these handprints are interesting, okay, for a couple reasons. First of all, I want to address subject matter when we're talking about cave paintings, okay? Your book, interestingly, only has one cave painting, so good thing you're watching this lecture to see some more examples. If you want even more examples, I recommend the documentary Cave of Forgotten Dreams. It's on Netflix streaming. It's by the filmmaker Werner Herzog, who is a total boss filmmaker. It's super good. I always tell my students to watch it. They always say it's such a good documentary. So this isn't just some like nerdy art history person that likes it. Your peers like it too. I recommend watching it. They do things with lasers, and anyways, it's good. Getting off track. So, back to this. In terms of subject matter, okay, the most common subject matter that we see in cave paintings is animals. Animals. There's very, very, very few representations of people. So this is kind of rare to have these handprints. Now, where are these handprints here? We don't know. We don't know. So, some people say, okay, they could be the handprint of an artist. I am uncomfortable with this. The reason why I'm uncomfortable with this is because they didn't have this concept of an artist creating this like unique form of expression where they sign their work. We don't really start to see that begin to happen until the late Middle Ages, which is a long time away. Some people say that they could be emblematic of the community. They could be handprints that belong to shaman. We really actually don't know. But what we do know, images of people are rare subject matter in Paleolithic art. Here's another example. This is probably one of the most famous of all the cave paintings produced in the Paleolithic period. This is the Hall of Bulls, which is located in the Lascaux Cave. I put this guy right here to give you a sense of scale, but also so that you could see where in the caves these would be situated typically. Now you can see that the date here, 15,000 to 13,000 BCE. This date ranges to when the cave was active. So for approximately 2,000 years, people were coming in here and they were painting on the cave walls. This is why the imagery is kind of confusing. We shouldn't try to construct narratives because they overlap. Here's some small ones, here's big ones, there's all this stuff going on up here. There's multitude of imagery, and this can make it complicated in our interpretations. Now what I want to talk about is another common technique of art making in the Paleolithic period called the twisted perspective. Now this idea of twisted perspective, this does extend beyond the Paleolithic period. We see this all the way up until at least Egypt. Maybe I would say maybe some of the earliest images of Greece, but at least through Egypt. And what twisted perspective is this. Take a look at this animal right here. We're looking at the animal in profile, which means from the side. However, this part right here, the horns, is frontal. It's like the tip top of his head has turned to face the front of the viewer. Not anatomically accurate, so twisted perspective almost is like a form of abstraction in a way. If this was in true profile, we would only see one horn. So what twisted perspective is profile and frontal views at the same time. Again, very common in Paleolithic art all the way through Egypt. Now, the question that I know has been burning in your brain that you've been wondering all along is why did they create cave art? Now, there's a lot of different possibilities as to why they created these paintings. One theory is this theory called art for art's sake. Art for art's sake. Which basically is like this. Either one, they made these paintings because they felt like it, or two, they made these paintings for decoration. This is what keeps me up at night. This is why I don't sleep, is because I don't like this theory. Now, here's why I don't like this theory. Okay, first of all, we talked about this idea that life is hard in the Paleolithic period. Every single thing people do, they do to survive. So to make art just because you feel like it, to take time out of hunting or gathering or doing whatever, to make a painting for no reason doesn't make sense. Now the other thing is there is zero archaeological evidence to indicate that people lived in these caves. So it wouldn't be like, oh, here's the painting that we're putting over our stone couch. Now this isn't to say that people didn't live in caves. They did, but in these caves we see these incredible paintings like Chauvet and Lascaux. They didn't live in there. There's no evidence to indicate that. So art for art's sake, I think, is a pretty sketchy theory. Now another theory is that these were created as part of a hunting ritual. Okay. Now, first of all, we can support this idea that these were part of a ritual because we can see that the people tried to protect them. The way that they tried to protect these paintings is by locating them in the back of the cave. So it's not like you would just walk into Lascaux and, oh, hey, here is a painting just sitting there. They put them in the back of the cave where you would have to go through like tunnels and you'd crawl and you'd shimmy and all of this stuff. And if you watch the documentary Cave of Forgotten Dreams, which is streaming on Netflix, it'll show you actually how much of like a maze and how complicated these cave systems really were. I personally think it's quite mind-blowing. I didn't know caves could be so intense and complicated. The other thing is within the genetics of people is not only the desire to make art, but it's also the desire to deface other people's property. And so they did hide these away to prevent hooligans from graffiti and things like that. So they protected them by putting them far back in the back of the cave. Now, the hunting ritual. So the idea is that there was some sort of ritual where they sort of projected a sharp object, probably some sort of stone, that it would hit the image of the animal and it would symbolically kill its spirit. So that when people went out to hunt and make the animal easier to kill. Now you could see why it would be worth it to put the time and energy into making a painting like this, because it actually helps you be successful in hunting. Now what some scholars have said to try to sort of discredit this theory is that, oh, well, not all of the animals depicted were eaten. Okay, maybe, but how about this idea that you could hunt animals and use them for other things like their hide or their bones and things like that? So I'm not really super on board with that criticism. Now, another theory is this idea of the shaman theory. I like this one. So the idea of the shaman is, and I like the hunting theory too, I will just say that. The idea with the shaman theory is that they would have these really significant religious figures called shaman. And the idea with the shaman is that they were able to sort of journey into this other spiritual realm. And they would go to this other spiritual realm to get information that would be helpful to their community, which is why they were so important. And so what would happen is they would travel to this other realm, and a lot of people suggest that they would do so aided by psychedelic drugs. And actually think about this. Think about this idea if you were tripping on drugs and then you went into a cave like this. And they talk about this in documentary, that if you're tripping on drugs and imagine like the light of the flame flickering of the torch, it actually made these animals look like they were moving, which that definitely I think would take you to another spiritual plane for sure. The other thing is this idea of the cave as sort of like a portal, as sort of a transitional space. And this is something that is relevant cross-cultural. All sorts of cultures see the cave as a portal. The Native Americans did, a lot of the pre-Columbians did as well. And so we could definitely argue that the idea of this as like a portal would make sense. Now in terms of then why do we see these animals connected to shamans? It could be a number of things. This could be like their spirit guides that take them into this other realm. This could be what they encounter when they get to this other realm. We can't know, to be quite honest. Now, other theories I've read that these could be representations of like male and female animals as a comment on like fertility and sexual reproduction and all those sorts of things, with horned animals being referencing men. And then the more female associated animals would be like the feline animals, the lion. So that's a possibility. Some people say that these were spaces for initiation, hunting initiations, perhaps like a coming of age initiation. There's a lot of different possibilities, but not one has really been completely embraced by the scholarly community. And this concludes our lecture on Paleolithic art.